Well, hi, everyone. Welcome to the second webinar from the UW Center for Cannabis Research in collaboration with WSU. We're very excited today to have Carrie Cuttler, who's a excellent researcher and speaker and actually a good friend of mine. So I'm really excited to give you the floor, Carrie, and we look forward to hearing your webinar.
Thank you, Nefi. I'm Carrie Cuttler. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at Washington State University. And today I'll be talking about some of my research on the chronic and acute effects of high potency cannabis on cognition. And just to give you a little bit of an overview of this talk, I'm going to start with just a very brief introduction, talking a little bit about cannabis use, cannabinoids, and the endocannabinoid system, just to give you a primer for the second two parts. The second part will focus on the influence of chronic cannabis use on cognition. So here I'm referring to the effects of regular cannabis use when people are entirely sober. And then for the third part, I'll talk about the acute effects of cannabis on cognition. And by acute, I mean those intoxicating effects when people are under the immediate influence of the drug. So again, just to start with cannabis use, cannabinoids, and the endocannabinoid system. Cannabis legalization is sweeping the nation, with recreational cannabis legal in 19 states and medical cannabis legal in 36. And this new legal cannabis market is absolutely booming, with sales exceeding $1.5 billion in Washington state alone in the 2020-2021 fiscal year, and national sales exceeding $20 billion. Cannabis is the most used federally illicit drug in America, with nearly half of Americans reporting that they have tried cannabis and nearly 20% reporting use in the past month. Rates of use are highest in young adults, with 35% of young adults reporting past month use. Now, there are over 100 phytocannabinoids in the cannabis plant that have been identified. And this term phytocannabinoid, by the way, is just referring to the fact that these are cannabinoids present in the plant. The most predominant one is THC, or delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, which was discovered by Raphael Mechoulam back in 1964. And he identified it as the compound responsible for the euphoric and intoxicating effects of cannabis. And it's also believed to be responsible for the cognitively impairing effects of cannabis. The second most commonly known phytocannabinoid is cannabidiol, or CBD. And some suggest that it might modulate some of the effects of THC, with a little bit of evidence indicating that while THC impairs memory and can produce psychosis, CBD might protect against some of the memory impairing effects of THC. And CBD has antipsychotic properties, as well as neuroprotective and antioxidant effects. But again, there are many other minor phytocannabinoids that we know almost nothing about, including CBC, CBN, CBG. And as I'll mention again at the end of my presentation, I'm actually working right now with some collaborators to conduct the first ever human clinical trial on those effects of CBG, cannabidiol. And then terpenes, or terpenoids, are a non-cannabinoid constituent that are starting to get a bit more attention. These contribute to the smell of the plant, and they're also presently thought to contribute to some of the therapeutic effects of cannabis, including some of those anti-inflammatory, antibacterial, antidepressant, and anxiolytic effects. Now, while some of these effects have been demonstrated using terpenes from other plants and foods, things like peppermint and lavender and rosemary and mangoes, there are no clinical trials really properly evaluating the effects of terpenes in cannabis specifically. So we really don't know much about their effects. Now, the discovery of THC and the cannabinoid receptor that it binds to prompted a search for naturally occurring cannabinoids. And once again, Mechoulam and his colleagues identified two such compounds. And these are collectively referred to as endocannabinoids. So phytocannabinoids are found in the cannabis plant, and endocannabinoids are found in us. Now, the two endocannabinoids are anandamide and 2-AG. The word anandamide, by the way, is derived from the Sanskrit word for supreme joy, and it's a partial agonist of CB1 and CB2 receptors, whereas 2-AG is a full agonist of these receptors. CB1 and CB2 are endocannabinoid receptors, and CB1 is actually the most abundant G-coupled protein receptor in the brain, but it is also found in some peripheral organs. Within the brain, there are high densities of CB1 receptors in the basal ganglia, cerebellum, and hippocampus. But they are entirely absent in the brainstem, which is exactly why people don't die from a cannabis overdose. CB2 receptors are predominantly found on cells of the immune system outside the central nervous system, and activation of CB2 does not seem to have the same intoxicating effects. Okay. So moving on to the influence of chronic cannabis use on cognition. Now, despite the common assumption that chronic cannabis use has detrimental effects on cognition, decades of research have really produced results that are fairly inconsistent and unreliable. And even reviews of the literature produce conflicting conclusions, with some authors of some review papers arguing that chronic cannabis use has clear detrimental effects on cognition, while others have argued that the non-acute effects of cannabis are negligible or even virtually absent. There was a recent review of previous meta-analyses, so a review of past reviews, that was published last year and indicates that the chronic effects of cannabis on cognition are most reliably detected on tests of memory, especially verbal free recall tests. And that also just tends to be the predominant type of memory test administered in cannabis studies. So reading people lists of words and having them recall them. Working memory tests also tend to show effects of chronic cannabis use. Executive functioning, especially inhibitory control and cognitive flexibility. And then smaller, less reliable effects are detected on tests of processing speed and attention. However, most of these effects are small to moderate in size. And many aspects of memory, like temporal order memory, remembering the order in which previous events happened, source memory, so remembering where or how we learned previous information, and false memory, so the susceptibility to falsely recalling things that didn't really happen. These have been really under-investigated, or in many cases not investigated at all. Now, there now appears to be a general consensus that using cannabis during adolescence, like before the age of 16, intensifies its harms, including its detrimental effects on cognition. Now, most of this research has been motivated by the fact that there are very important developmental changes in the brain that occur during adolescence, and the endocannabinoid system is involved in many of those changes. And there's some evidence that using cannabis during adolescence can alter the normal development of the brain and potentially result in subsequent cognitive impairment. Now, while this is a very logical, very compelling argument, and there is evidence that supports this theory, many of the studies that have been conducted in support of it have been pretty poorly controlled. So for instance, many studies, especially a lot of the preclinical studies, have supported this hypothesis by simply showing that exposure to cannabis early in life has detrimental effects relative to no exposure. But really, to properly test this claim, one really needs to also compare these two groups to cannabis users exposed later in life, right? If the effects of cannabis exposure are really worse during adolescence, then we should also see differences between earlier onset users and later onset users. Furthermore, few human studies consider improperly control for potentially confounding differences in these groups of early onset users, later onset users, and non-users. So for instance, we might expect people who started to use cannabis really early on in life, like at the age of 13 or 14, maybe they're also more likely to use alcohol and other drugs. They might be more impulsive. They might have more early life stress. That might be why they're using cannabis in the first place. They might even have pre-existing cognitive impairments. And these kinds of potential group differences are not often considered in this area of research. Now, on the other end of the age spectrum, older adults are the fastest growing population of cannabis users. And they report, we found in a recent study, enhanced medical benefits and decreased negative effects like side effects of cannabis use. However, the same cognitive abilities that are negatively affected by chronic cannabis use are also known to decline with age. So we also see age-related declines in memory, executive functioning, processing speed, and attention, which might lead one to the hypothesis that chronic cannabis users might show accelerated age-related cognitive decline. However, a very small body of research suggests the exact opposite. That cannabis might actually protect the aging brain. So CB1 knockout mice, right, who don't have those CB1 receptors, they will demonstrate accelerated cognitive decline. And 2 other studies found that THC-treated older mice actually performed better than their vehicle-treated older counterparts, and more similarly to younger vehicle-treated mice on learning and spatial memory tasks. Now, one study that was using more of a balanced THC-CBD ratio did not find these same effects. And I'll mention that all these studies did involve a washout period where the animals were not being administered THC. So these were assessing the chronic rather than the acute or intoxicating effects of cannabis. But very importantly, there are no human studies to corroborate this preclinical literature. So the goal of my first study was to examine chronic cannabis users' cognition under sober conditions. And in doing so, I wanted to compare early onset cannabis users who started using before the age of 16 to later onset cannabis users and non-users, while controlling for confounding differences in these groups. I also wanted to examine age-related declines in cognition in cannabis users and non-users. So these are my inclusion and exclusion criteria. Basically, people needed to be at least 18 years of age, and to be classified as a chronic cannabis user, they had to report daily or near daily use for at least the past year. And they also had to have a positive urine test for THC metabolites. Non-users had to use fewer than 10 times in their entire life. They couldn't have any past year use, and they had to have a negative urine test for THC metabolites. Participants could not be diagnosed or treated with any serious medical, neurological, psychiatric conditions, learning disabilities, concussions, head injuries, substance use disorders. They couldn't report recent use of illicit drugs, heavy drinking, or heavy smoking. Cannabis users had to abstain from using any cannabis whatsoever on the day of the testing session, so that we would be looking at those chronic or residual effects and not the acute effects. And then experimenters were blinded to participants' cannabis use status, so they didn't know if people were cannabis users or not. After filtering out a lot of people who failed to meet our study requirements, we ended up with a sample of 113 chronic cannabis users and 109 non-users. So 54 of the cannabis users reported using cannabis before the age of 16, and that they were designated as our early onset users, which is consistent with the designation used in the literature. And the remaining 58 reported using cannabis after that age. The complete sample ranged in age from 18 to 65 with a mean around 26. And importantly, these 2 groups did not differ with respect to their mean age or the variance in their age. These participants completed an approximately 1.5-hour battery of cognitive tests, including tests of prospective memory, retrospective memory, source memory, temporal order memory, psychomotor speed and attention, and executive functioning. Now, to examine confounds in the comparisons of non-users, early onset users, and later onset users, these three groups were compared with respect to various demographic variables, alcohol use problems, use of cigarettes, impulsivity, as well as premorbid verbal IQ. The group showed significant differences in ethnicity, with significantly more cannabis users being white than were the non-users. There were differences with respect to education, with both groups of cannabis users having significantly less education than the non-users. Differences in problematic cannabis use, with both groups of cannabis users having more problems with alcohol. Cigarette use, we see that early onset users specifically smoke more cigarettes than non-users. We see group differences in impulsivity, with later onset users, interestingly, being significantly more impulsive than non-users, but not early onset users. And there's also group differences in verbal IQ, with early onset users reporting significantly lower verbal IQ than non-users, and that should be a B. So importantly, because of these confounding group differences, these 6 variables do represent confounds, and they will be controlled for and are controlled for in the subsequent analyses I'm about to show you, where we're comparing these 3 groups. So the test battery included a couple of tests of prospective memory. Prospective memory refers to our ability to remember to do things at a later time. And to measure this, we first asked participants to try to remember to provide a difficulty rating immediately after completing each test. They were told that they wouldn't be prompted to do this, and that it was instead up to them to spontaneously provide these difficulty ratings as soon as each test was completed. And so here you're looking at the number of difficulty ratings given, and we see a small but significant effect on this test. Specifically, the late onset cannabis users perform significantly worse than the non-cannabis users on this test. The early onset cannabis users' performance didn't differ from either of these 2 groups. Now, as another measure of prospective memory, participants were required to try to remember to request for their compensation at the end of the study before doing an online survey that had again occurred at the end of the study. And the results, again, controlling for potentially confounding group differences, or the actual confounding group differences in education, ethnicity, cigarette use, alcohol use, impulsivity, verbal IQ. After controlling for all those differences, we do see a small but significant difference across the 3 groups, such that both groups of cannabis users performed worse on this reminder test than did the non-users. And the difference between the early and late onset users is not statistically significant. Now, to assess verbal free recall, we use the California Verbal Learning Test. Again, this is very commonly used in cannabis studies. For this test, participants hear a list of 16 words, and they're asked to immediately recall the words. They do this a few times. And then about 20 minutes later, they're asked to subsequently recall that list for the delayed trial. Again, after controlling for those confounding differences in those 6 variables, we do see, again, a small but significant difference across the 3 groups, such that both groups of cannabis users demonstrate worse performance than non-users on both the immediate and delayed recall trials of this verbal learning test. Moving on to source memory. So here for this test, we showed participants a series of basic pictures and printed words. And after a little delay, they were asked to freely recall as many pictures and as many words as they could. And we see no significant effects of chronic cannabis use on free recall on this test. Now, subsequently, participants are presented with another series of items, and they're asked to indicate which were previously presented as pictures and which were previously presented as words. And here what we see is a significant difference, a group difference, such that the early onset cannabis users are performing significantly worse than late onset users, specifically for their source memory for pictures. Neither of the groups of cannabis users differed from the non-users, however. It was just the early onset users differing from the late onset users. We found no significant effects on a visual spatial memory test, in which participants were shown one page that had 6 figures like this. The page is taken away. They have to draw those figures, reproduce the figures. They do this a couple trials. Then after a delay, they're asked to reproduce those figures again. Again, we see no effects on this test. We see no effects on a temporal order memory test that required participants to freely recall all of the tests they completed and in the correct order, and then organize a bunch of cards that describe the tests in the correct order they were administered. And we don't see any effects of chronic cannabis use. We found no effects on a DigiSpan backward test of working memory, which is a little surprising because that is, again, one of the domains that the literature reviews have kind of indicated tends to show effects. Here, participants were read a series of numbers and then they just had to recall them in reverse order. We saw no effects on a color word interference test. You might know this as a Stroop test that involves some inhibition and switching. So for this test, participants first have to name the color of color patches as quickly as possible. So they'd say red. Next, they have to read color words printed in black ink as quickly as possible. So they would need to say red. And we see no effects. Next, they have to indicate the color of the ink of color words printed in incongruent ink color. So here they would need to say red. And our natural tendency would be to say blue. And then finally, they have to switch between naming the ink color and reading the word. If the word is in a box, they have to read the word. So again, this response would be red again. And again, we don't see any significant effects of chronic cannabis use, either early or later onset, on performance on this test. We also found no significant effects on a ZooMap test or the Tower test. These are both measures of executive functioning, more specifically planning. And we saw no effects on a digit symbol substitution test, which is a measure of attention that requires participants to look at this legend first. You see, we've got symbols matched with numbers. Below this is a sheet of just numbers, and people have to fill in the corresponding symbol as quickly and as accurately as possible. At the end, we take the legend away and we make them do it from memory. And here's their recall total performance. And again, we don't see any significant effects here or on the rough 2 and 7 test of attention, which basically requires participants to cross out every 2 and 7 on 2 full pages of numbers. So just to give you an interim summary, the results indicate that chronic cannabis use may have detrimental effects on verbal free recall. So recalling lists of words, which is very consistent with previous research. Results also indicate that regular use might have effects on source memory and prospective memory. And we saw specifically those early onset cannabis users who started using before the age of 16 demonstrated worse source memory test performance for pictures specifically, but their performance did not differ from non-users. In contrast, we saw that later onset users had more prospective memory failures on the difficulty ratings test relative to non-users. And both groups of cannabis users demonstrated worse performance on the reminder prospective memory test. And these results are fairly consistent with a very small literature suggesting that chronic cannabis use might have negative effects on prospective memory, our ability to remember to do things. But overall, I would say my data show pretty weak evidence for this theory that early onset cannabis use is more detrimental to cognition than later onset use. Instead, my data are really suggesting that chronic cannabis use is detrimental to memory, at any time it's initiated. Okay, now with respect to the last aim of the first study, remember that was to examine whether cannabis might protect against age-related declines in cognition. So to test this hypothesis, I correlated test performance with age separately in the cannabis users and the non-users. What you can see here are significant negative correlations between age and performance on the immediate and delayed recall trial of the California Verbal Learning Test in both the non-users and the cannabis users. Sorry, the immediate recall trial, we see a negative correlation with age in both the non-users and the cannabis users. In the delayed recall trial, we see a negative correlation with age in the non-users. We don't see a significant age-related decline in performance on the delayed recall trial in cannabis users. In contrast with a brief visual spatial memory test where they have to remember those geometric figures and reproduce them, we see negative correlations between age and performance on both the immediate and delayed recall trials in both the cannabis users and the non-users. Looking at prospective memory, we see a negative correlation between age and performance on the difficulty ratings test in the non-users, and we do not see the same age-related declines in performance in the cannabis users. This line is not significantly different from 0 or flat. For the reminder prospective memory test, we don't see negative correlations with age in either of the groups. I'm just showing you results where we see a significant correlation between performance and age in at least one of these two groups. Every other test doesn't show any negative correlations with age in either group. Now looking at source memory, we again see the significant age-related decline in performance in the non-users, while the cannabis users' performance is rather flat across the lifespan. Looking at digit symbol substitution test, the recall trial where we take away the legend and they just have to fill in those symbols from memory. We again see a significant negative correlation between performance and age in the non-users, and that correlation is not significant in the cannabis users. Same with the copy trial where they have access to the legend and we're just looking at psychomotor speed and attention, filling in all those symbols. Again, we see a significant negative correlation with age in the non-users, and the slope is flat in the cannabis users. And then finally, looking at executive functioning with the Tower test and the ZooMap test, we see significant negative correlations between age and performance on both of these measures of executive functioning in the non-users. And again, the line in this case is actually completely flat for the Tower test in the cannabis users. And same with the ZooMap test. There's no significant correlation with age in the cannabis users. So it appears that age-related declines in cognition are dampened in chronic cannabis users, right? Only the California verbal memory test and the brief visual spatial memory test revealed any significant age-related declines in the memory of cannabis users. These effects were particularly pronounced on measures of executive functioning requiring speed. And that's really interesting because cognitive slowing is really the major cognitive change that's happening with age. And what we're seeing is that regular cannabis use might be tempering some of that cognitive slowing. Now, future research is needed to better understand the mechanisms underlying these effects. But one previous study found that a CB1 agonist triggered neurogenesis and an anti-inflammatory cytokine profile in the hippocampus of aged rats. Also, we know that CB1 receptor expression and 2-HG levels are reduced during aging. And there's been one previous study that found that THC improved hippocampal gene transcription patterns and hippocampal spine density in older mice. So it's possible that cannabis is reducing neuroinflammation and declines in neurogenesis associated with aging. Now, I'm a predominantly human researcher. I study humans, so I can't help but wonder if some of these differences in impairment stem from differences in impairments from medical conditions that are driving these effects. So we know that a lot of older adults are using cannabis medicinally, to alleviate pain, to help them sleep. Well, if these older adults are less burdened by pain and fatigue and other medical symptoms, they might be able to perform better and faster on some of these tests. I also can't help but wonder if people who are using cannabis later in life might have some differences in personality. Maybe they're more open to experience, and maybe that's driving some of these effects. Now, my study really did target healthy adults, and future research is needed to better understand the effects of chronic cannabis use on people experiencing things like mild cognitive impairment or dementia. Also, I used a cross-sectional design, right? I didn't want to wait for my 20-year-olds to turn 65 or 80. I'd be retired by that point myself. But it would be so much better to tackle this question using a longitudinal design where the same people are tracked across a lifespan. And finally, it would be really interesting to examine the acute effects of cannabis on cognition in older adults. So overall, the results of this first study show that the effects of chronic cannabis use on cognition were fairly modest and limited to a select few measures of memory. More interestingly, the effects seem to depend on the stage of the lifespan. Now, given past research showing early onset cannabis use may be more detrimental, I'd say it is still certainly better and best to avoid using cannabis really early on in life. But the exciting findings from AIM-2 are really the first human data to corroborate a couple of animal studies showing that cannabis may protect against age-related declines in cognition. We need to see a lot more research there. Okay, I'm about the halfway point, and I'm going to now transition to talk about two studies focused on examining the acute, the intoxicating effects of cannabis on cognition. So similar to how impairments in verbal free recall, so remembering lists of words, are reliably detected in sober chronic cannabis users, one of the most robust detrimental acute effects of cannabis is also on the free recall of word lists. But again, this also just tends to be the predominant type of memory test that is used in cannabis research. Further, there's some very limited evidence that CBD may protect against some of the memory impairing effects of THC, with 2 previous studies providing evidence to that effect. However, much less is known about the acute effects of high-potency cannabis, as I'll discuss momentarily, and very few studies have examined effects on more naturalistic tests of memory. For instance, no previous studies have examined the acute effects of cannabis on prospective memory or temporal order memory. Only 3 previous studies have looked at the effects on false memory. One of the 3 did find a significant effect, a detrimental effect of high potency cannabis on false memory. So that study was conducted outside of North America, and they were able to use high potency cannabis in that. And only 2 studies have examined source memory. Both of those studies have produced null effects. Similarly, most studies that have examined decision-making have used tests of risky decision-making, things like the Iowa gambling task or delayed discounting, and none have examined effects on more non-normative decision-making. So like Kahneman and Tversky type tasks, looking at things like framing biases and risk perception and susceptibility to sunk cost. Far more studies have examined the effects on attention and executive dysfunction, but the results here have been pretty equivocal. And maybe that's because of a really heavy reliance on low potency products. Just generally speaking, almost all previous studies conducted in North America have relied on very low potency cannabis. And the use of such low potency products may be driving some of these null effects. So the reason we know so very little about the acute effects of high potency cannabis products on cognition, or anything else for that matter, is because the current federal classification of cannabis as a Schedule I drug severely limits our ability to study the drug. So while any adult aged 21 or older can walk into any dispensary in our state and many others and purchase a variety of high potency cannabis products, researchers have to spend years applying to numerous agencies before they can administer cannabis to research participants in their laboratories. And getting a license from the DEA alone can take upward of 18 months. And they also need approvals from FDA, sometimes the Department of Health, their ethics board, their institution. Further, until very recently, researchers in the US have been required to only use cannabis sourced from the NIDA drug supply, the National Institute on Drug Abuse drug supply, for their research. Now, the problem as shown on this slide is the cannabis NIDA produces is really not at all representative of the high potency and high quality cannabis products that consumers are accessing and using. So until very recently, the highest potency cannabis that NIDA has produced is under 10% THC. Well, consumers are accessing cannabis flower that has more than 20% THC and cannabis concentrates that easily exceed 90% THC. Genetic analyses on NIDA-provided research-grade cannabis have found that NIDA cannabis is substantially genetically different from most commercially available cannabis strains, with NIDA cannabis sharing a closer genetic affinity with hemp samples than with market cannabis. And while the NIDA drug supply includes low potency flower and concentrates for animal, but not human research, the concentrates, that black tar looking stuff there is only for animals. Cannabis dispensaries instead carry an enormous variety of high potency cannabis products, including flower that again can easily exceeds 20% THC. And we've got edibles, a huge variety of different edibles here. There's tinctures, there's lotions, there's suppositories, a whole variety of these high potency cannabis concentrates. And we know almost nothing about most of these products because they are not available through the NIDA drug supply. So the goal of my next study was to examine the acute effects of high potency cannabis on everyday life memory and non-normative decision. And in doing so, I wanted to compare the effects of cannabis flower containing CBD to cannabis flower that doesn't have CBD. I also wanted to compare the effects of cannabis concentrates to cannabis flower. And we were able to bypass the legal restrictions on acute cannabis research by having participants purchase and administer their own cannabis in their own environment while we simply observed them over Zoom. So we conducted an observational field experiment. Participants were randomly assigned to purchase and use one of 3 different product types or remain sober. And we just emailed them a list of products that met the specifications for their groups. And they brought that list to the dispensary when making their purchase for the study. Participants abstained from using any cannabis for a minimum of 8 hours before the session. They couldn't use on the day of the session at all. And the average abstinence period was closer to 24 hours. We did some baseline measures. Then we observed them using their cannabis product or abstaining from use over Zoom. Then we administered a series of cognitive tests over Zoom. We compensated participants for their time, but not their cannabis purchase, using Amazon gift cards. And we chose Amazon because at least as of today, you cannot purchase cannabis on Amazon. So I was able to bypass all the legal restrictions surrounding acute cannabis research because participants were legally purchasing and using their own cannabis in their own environment. I never purchased, administered, or even touched the drug. I simply observed a legal act. These were our exclusion and exclusion criteria. So basically participants had to be very healthy, right? They couldn't be using other drugs. They couldn't be heavy drinkers or smokers. This time they also couldn't be pregnant or breastfeeding. And then to minimize the risk of anyone having a serious adverse event, they couldn't have reported experiencing any previous severe adverse reactions to cannabis. They also had to be experienced cannabis users, and they had to have experience using cannabis flower and concentrates. We didn't want to introduce a newer, higher potency version of the drug to anyone. They also had to be of legal age to purchase and use cannabis in our state. We recruited 80 people who met these criteria and randomly assigned them to one of 4 groups. So 20 were assigned to serve as a sober control group. 20 were randomly assigned to purchase and use THC flower. So they purchased and used a joint containing at least 20% THC and no CBD. 20 were randomly assigned to a THC plus CBD flower group, where they purchased and smoked a joint containing at least 20% THC and at least 0.7% CBD. We initially aimed for way higher CBD concentrations, but they just proved exceptionally difficult to find in high potency market cannabis. Finally, 20 participants are randomly assigned to purchase and use a cannabis concentrate oil that contain at least 60% THC and again, at least 0.7% CBD. And importantly, random assignment did work to produce groups who were equivalent with respect to all demographic characteristics, all cannabis use patterns, pre-morbid verbal IQ, everything we measured. Now we recorded the number of puffs participants took, and we timed the duration of their inhalations and holds. And we found that participants randomly assigned to use an extremely high potency cannabis concentrate took significantly fewer puffs than those smoking flower joints. They also took longer inhalations. And by taking far less of this higher potency version of the drug, they did achieve comparable levels of intoxication to those using flower. So participants rated their level of intoxication before using any cannabis. The sober control group remained completely sober, while all 3 cannabis using groups had dramatic increases in intoxication ratings that were sustained throughout the entire duration of the study and that never differed between product types. We assessed temporal order memory again by asking people to freely recall all the tests they completed in the correct order. We assessed prospective memory by having participants try to remember to rate how difficult they found each test, and also to try to remember to request their compensation at the end of the study. We found no significant effects of acute cannabis intoxication on temporal order memory test performance. You can see everyone performed pretty miserably on the difficulty ratings test, with performance at about 50%. But when sufficiently motivated, even the people who were intoxicated on this very high potency cannabis concentrate were quite successful in asking for their Amazon gift cards. Again, looking at source memory, where we show them pictures and words, ask them to freely recall them, and then indicate which were shown as pictures and which were shown as words. You can see here that specifically the group that smoked the joint containing both THC and CBD had worse free recall for pictures relative to the sober control group. Looking at true source memory, distinguishing which were pictures, which were words, you can see that the group that smoked the flower joint containing THC and the group that smoked the cannabis concentrate had worse source memory specifically for pictures than did the sober control group. We use something called the Deese-Roediger-McDermott paradigm to assess false memory. So here participants listen to a list of words, and all the words in the list are related to a critical lure that is never presented. So they might hear words like tired, pillow, dream, bed. All these words are related to the critical lure of sleep, but that's never presented. After the words are presented, they do a free recall test. They just recall as many words as you can. And again, we see this group who smoked the joint containing THC and CBD had worse free recall than the sober control group. We didn't see any significant effects on false memory for the critical lures when we did a recognition test, saying, was this word presented? Was that word presented? Was sleep presented? But we did find that participants who used the cannabis concentrate had more false memories for other related words, maybe something like soft. And all 3 cannabis using groups had more false memories for completely unrelated words, something like truck, relative to the sober control group. And then finally, we found no significant effects of high potency cannabis on decision-making, including their confidence in their knowledge, the consistency in their risk perception, framing biases, so whether information is framed in a positive or negative way, is a loss or a gain, or sunk cost bias. So to summarize, we found significant effects of high potency cannabis on free recall, source memory, and susceptibility to false memory. We found no significant effects on decision-making, prospective memory, temporal order memory. But power might be a little bit low to detect some of these effects, especially on the prospective memory test. We found no evidence that CBD offset the detrimental effects of THC. In fact, the group that smoked the joint containing both THC and CBD demonstrated more memory impairments than the group that smoked just the flower joint containing just THC. Now, I mentioned 2 previous studies found evidence that CBD might offset some of the detrimental effects of THC on memory. But looking closer at the literature, one of the authors of one of those studies was not able to replicate their own findings. And there's more emerging evidence that CBD might actually potentiate some of the effects of THC and produce higher blood concentrations of THC. Finally, there were no significant differences in concentrates and flowers. Now, this to me is a very interesting and novel finding, as there's been a great deal of concern that extremely high potency cannabis concentrates will magnify harms. But due to limitations in the NIDA drug supply, there's been almost no research on concentrates. My finding indicates that users are self-titrating their use of these concentrates. They're just using less of the higher potency drug to achieve comparable levels of intoxication and impairment. Now, the primary criticisms I received from reviewers of this study pertain to the lack of a placebo control group. That's a very fair, valid criticism. Unfortunately, the dispensaries just don't sell placebos. Another criticism was some reviewers didn't like the fact that we used a between subjects design. We had different people in the different conditions. Even though our groups were well matched, within subjects designs are generally superior. Reviewers didn't like my use of less conventional, unstandardized tests of memory. I wanted to break away from the conventional domains. And then some reviewers suggested that it would be best to have a control group of sober non-users. So for the 3rd study that's still ongoing, we opted to administer standardized tests using a within subjects design and a control group of sober non-users. So we have cannabis users and non-users complete 2 sessions separated by about a week. Cannabis users are sober in the first session. Then in the second session, we observe them using their own cannabis product before they do the same cognitive tests they did in the first session. Non-users remain sober in both sessions to control for potential practice effects. Now, given how hard it was to recruit decent sized samples from my small community, we decided to open this study up to every state where cannabis is legal. That meant we couldn't send people to dispensaries to purchase specific products. But since we didn't really find many effects or differences across the different product types, we felt that was a sacrifice we were willing to make to improve the feasibility of this study. At the last time I analyzed data, we had 37 non-users and 26 cannabis users complete both sessions. As you can see, the cannabis users are using really high potency cannabis again, with a mean concentration of THC in the flower of at least 21%. A small sample did use cannabis concentrates that exceeded 75% THC. We again counted puffs and time duration of inhalations and holds, and consistent with the first study, we found concentrate users did take significantly fewer puffs and had longer inhalations, but they rated equivalent levels of intoxication at all 4 time points after use. So they got equally high and they stayed equally high throughout the duration. This difference is not statistically significant. Okay, starting with memory test performance, we found significant effects on the California verbal learning test, where people have to remember lists of words immediately and after a delay. Specifically, we found a main effect on the immediate recall trial, indicating that across both sessions combined, cannabis users just perform worse than non-users. We also found a significant main effect of cannabis use status on the digit symbol or digit span backwards test, which is a test of working memory. Once again, across both sessions combined, cannabis users are performing worse than non-users. When we start to compare every group with each other, what we see with these simple effects analyses is that it's really the cannabis users at time 2 that are performing significantly worse than sober non-users at time 2. So we have intoxicated cannabis users performing worse than sober non-users. Interestingly, though, they are not performing worse than their sober selves. So that reviewer was right. It's nice to have a sober non-user group. This effect kind of represents a combined effect of chronic and acute use. And we see the same thing on digit span backwards, our test of working memory, where intoxicated cannabis users are performing worse than sober non-users, but not their sober selves. We found no significant effects of chronic or acute use or their combined effects on a delayed discounting task. Due to time, I won't explain this task in detail. Turning to the TOVA, which is a really long and really boring test of sustained attention. People just have to press the space bar whenever they see a target like this, and they have to refrain from pressing the space bar when they see a non-target like this. We found some cannabis by time interactions. None of the simple effects were significant, so nothing terribly interesting in my opinion there. But we did find another main effect of cannabis use status on errors of commission, with cannabis users showing more errors of commission across the 2 sessions combined than non-users. A commission is just when they press the space bar when they weren't supposed to at a non-target. And again, a simple effects analysis again shows that it really is the intoxicated cannabis users at time 2 who are performing worse than the sober non-users at time 2. They're not performing significantly worse than their sober selves. We see no significant effects on the digit symbol substitution test or this trail making test where people have to first connect numbers in order and then switch. This is cognitive flexibility, switch between numbers and letters, connecting 1 to A to 2, 2 to B, B to 3, and so on. We found no significant effects on a go, no-go test of attention. We did find significant effects on this color word interference test, specifically on the trials where they had to identify the ink color of words printed in an incongruent ink and where they had to switch between doing this and reading words. We see overall cannabis users combined across both sessions are performing worse than non-users. And in a simple effects analysis, again, where we're just comparing all these groups to each other, all these bars to each other, all we really see is, again, it's the intoxicated cannabis users who are performing worse than sober non-users, but not their sober selves. So to summarize, we replicated findings from the second study too, I guess, demonstrating that people using concentrates use significantly less of this extremely high potency version of the drug in order to achieve comparable levels of intoxication. And in the first study, we found impairment, suggesting these products might not magnify harms. Again, we need to see so much more research done on these products first, though. We did not detect any actual effects of acute cannabis intoxication in the cannabis users, right? We didn't see any impairments in time 2 compared to time 1 in the cannabis users. We did see significant main effects of cannabis use status, suggesting that across both sessions combined, cannabis users are just performing worse than non-users. We also saw several significant simple effects of cannabis use at time 2, where again, these intoxicated cannabis users are performing worse than sober non-users, but not their sober selves. Kind of reflecting like a double hit, right? Of being both a chronic cannabis user who is also now intoxicated. The lack of acute effects of even these very high potency cannabis products on cognition may be due in part to the fact that we recruited very experienced users. So most of the users were chronic cannabis users using cannabis on a daily or near daily basis. And it's apparent that some people do habituate to the effects of cannabis. Now, the fact that we had these people using their products and performing these tests in their own familiar and comfortable home environment instead of the foreign and sometimes anxiety-provoking laboratory environment may have contributed to some of the null effects as well. Now, one of the biggest strengths of these 2 acute studies is that we were able to bypass US federal restrictions on acute cannabis research in a manner that results in very high ecological validity. So we could examine the high potency products like concentrates that consumers are actually using in their typical manner of use in their home environment. Also, for the first acute study, we were using more naturalistic tests of memory and and decision making that better map onto the kinds of things we need to remember and decide about in real life. Primary limitations of these studies is, of course, the lack of a placebo control group. So some of the effects might represent expectancy effects. We opted not to control the smoking session, so we did not control dose, and that was really to reduce our legal risks. And it led to a very interesting finding that people self-titrate their use of these really high potency products to achieve comparable levels of intoxication. We also had a broad diversity of products in the second study. We didn't control the products in the last study. And we had kind of small samples of experienced users, which may have reduced some sensitivity to detect effects. So while the harms of chronic cannabis use on cognition appear to be fairly modest and most readily apparent when people are under the direct influence of the drug, cannabis users should be aware of the potential impacts on their memory, executive functioning, and attention, and really avoid cannabis when they need to remember to do things or use their memory. They should also use more memory aiding strategies to reduce memory failures in the real world, including writing down lists of items to be remembered, like grocery lists, setting alarms to remind them of upcoming appointments and responsibilities. Now, just very quickly, I'm continuing to work to refine the Zoom methodology and address some of the limitations. So Ethan Russo, Ziva Cooper, and I are currently conducting a double-blind, placebo-controlled crossover trial to look at the acute effects of cannabidiol, CBG, on cognition, mood, and stress. So we're working directly with a distributor who mails our participants CBG and placebo tinctures in small color-coded vials, and only me and Ethan know what these color codes represent. Then over the course of 2 Zoom sessions separated by a week or 2, participants ingest each product over Zoom. Then they do different tests of cognition, mood, stress, and intoxication. I'm very excited about this trial, and if you have any interest in it, do feel free to reach out to me. And I would just like to acknowledge my entire lab and all members of my health and cognition lab. I'm featuring these 4 wonderful young women who assisted with these various cognitive studies. Emily LaFrance was very critical in study 1 and study 2, well, actually all studies, study 3 as well. Amanda Stuber here and Robin Herbert are very focused on that last study that I discussed. And Aria has also been assisting with the 2nd and 3rd studies. I'd also like to thank the Alcohol and Drug Abuse Research Program and WSU's dedicated marijuana account for funding this research. The funds for the dedicated marijuana account actually come from the tax dollars from recreational cannabis sales in our state. We get a very small portion of this money back to study cannabis. And that money has proven critical to advancing our science on cannabis. I'd like to also thank you for your attention and time.
Thank you, Carrie. That was super great. Thank you so much for giving this webinar. All right. You all have a great day.
Thank you.